The girl whispered, "Please, make it quick." Dust hung in the rafters like judgment, thick and unmoving. The air inside the abandoned warehouse was heavy with sweat and the stink of silence. Lanterns hissed low, their flames flickering against the rusted metal beams, and crates stacked like makeshift pews in a church that had long since lost its god. No one spoke. She stood alone, barefoot, wrists bound in fraying rope, and a gash beneath her eye had turned the skin around it to a purple bloom. Her dress, once white, now brown with earth and blood, clung to her as if trying to disappear. She didn't look at the men, didn't plead, just stared at the floor as though it were the only thing that hadn't betrayed her. A man in a vest 3 sizes too small cleared his throat and raised a ledger with a gloved hand. "Labor bond, 1 female, age unclear. Strong back, no known kin. We'll start at 200. No one moved. It wasn't that she was worthless. It was that she was Ute. And in Cedar Hollow, 1878, that meant the same thing. A merchant coughed and leaned against a barrel. A rancher scoffed. 200 for her? She's cursed. They don't cry when you whip 'em.
Just stare like they're looking through ya. The price dropped. 150, 120, still no takers. Caleb Thatcher stood in the back, arms crossed, leaning against a wooden beam worn smooth by time. His coat was dusty, his boots cracked. He didn't come here to buy anyone. He hadn't come to buy anything in 5 years, since the night his wife died in a fever he couldn't afford to treat. And yet, there was something in that girl's stillness that struck him, something he recognized. Not fear, not defeat, something far older, like a tree that keeps standing long after lightning has split it in two. 75? The man called, voice cracking now. 50? Laughter snickered like rats in a cellar. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar. He raised it in silence. Heads turned. The auctioneer blinked. $1? Caleb said nothing. A pause, a shrug. Sold. There was no applause, just the sound of footsteps as the girl was shoved forward, wrists untied with a dull knife. She didn't flinch, didn't look at him, just stood, swaying slightly, as though waiting for the next order. Caleb stepped forward and took off his coat.
Without a word, he wrapped it around her shoulders. Her hands didn't lift to hold it. Her eyes remained low. No thanks, no trust, only quiet. He didn't expect gratitude. He expected what he saw, the ghost of someone still alive. He led her outside, away from the flickering lanterns and back into the chill night. The moon was high, its pale light casting the shadow of a man and a girl across the red dust. As they reached his horse, she hesitated. He didn't rush her. Instead, he untied the rope from the saddle, handed her a canteen, and climbed up first. She watched him a moment longer, then, without looking in his eyes, climbed behind. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. No questions, no explanations, only wind and hooves and the brittle rustle of dry sage. It wasn't salvation, it was survival. But that night, as the stars stretched like a frozen river above them, Caleb remembered the verse his mother used to recite when she worked the fields with hands that never stopped bleeding. "Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed." Psalm 82:3. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years, but tonight he rode with it burning in his chest. That silver coin didn't just buy back a life. It called in a debt. And debts like this, they never settle easy. The girl didn't speak for hours, Not on the ride, not when the ranch came into view with its leaning barn and silent house, not when Caleb dismounted and offered her a hand down. She took it only long enough to steady herself, then stepped back, eyes scanning the fence lines as though measuring how far she could run. Caleb didn't stop her. He opened the front door and let the lantern light spill out across the porch. Inside, everything smelled of old wood and ash, of a life paused in grief. The house wasn't messy. It was too empty for that. No photos, no music, just a cross nailed above the fireplace, and a Bible lying closed on the mantel, the leather cracked and sun-faded. She lingered on the threshold, waiting. He didn't invite her in. He just stepped aside. Inside the kitchen, he ladled a pot of beans into a wooden bowl, set it down with half a loaf of cornbread, then slid a cup of warm water across the table. No salt, no sugar, just enough. She didn't sit, didn't touch the food. Caleb didn't look at her. He unbuckled the knife from his belt and placed it on the far shelf, just close enough for him, but out of her reach. Then he moved to the corner and sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn up. Still no words. It was a long while before she approached the table. When she did, it wasn't hunger that moved her, it was exhaustion. She picked up the spoon like it weighed more than her hand could bear. Her first bite was dry, the second slower. Caleb closed his eyes, and in the dark behind his lids he saw another girl, smaller, fevered, skin hot and slick. He'd sat just like this then too, hands clasped, helpless, praying the town doctor would ride faster. But the doctor had waited for payment up front, and Eliza had died waiting. He opened his eyes. The room was the same, but the girl was different. Her hair was braided in the style of the Ute people, though half the braid had come undone. Around her neck hung a leather cord, hidden beneath his coat. When she shifted slightly, it peeked out, woven feathers, dyed red and blue, bound with sinew. He recognized it. Not the pattern, the meaning. A tribal heirloom. She caught him looking and stuffed it back beneath the coat, her gaze suddenly sharp. Caleb didn't ask. He wouldn't. Instead, he said, "You can sleep in the back room. Door locks from the inside." She stared at him, then, after a moment, rose and walked down the narrow hall. He waited until he heard the click of a latch before he moved. He banked the fire, then poured himself a cup of the same water he'd given her. No whiskey, not tonight, not when the ghosts were this close. In the dim glow, he stood at the kitchen window and watched the prairie. Somewhere out there, the moonlight skimmed over bones buried long before Cedar Hollow had a name. He knew this land held blood. He just hadn't known how fresh it still ran. Behind him, the sound of the door creaked open. He turned, half expecting to see her run. But instead, she stood in the hallway, the coat wrapped tight around her. "I didn't thank you," she said quietly. "You don't have to," he replied. She hesitated, then said something in a language he didn't recognize, soft, rhythmic, like prayer. Her voice barely carried. Then the door shut again. Caleb didn't ask what the words meant. Some things didn't need translation. Some things were sacred. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. Mornings came quietly at the Thatcher Ranch. The prairie didn't announce the sun, it simply exhaled. Light spilled over dry earth and weathered fences, filling cracks in the world that no hand could repair. On the second morning after she arrived, Nayeli stood on the back steps barefoot, clutching Caleb's old coat tighter around her shoulders. The wind tugged at the braid she had reforged, neater now, pulled close to the nape of her neck. She didn't speak when Caleb handed her a tin mug of coffee, but she didn't flinch either. That was something. He gestured toward the chicken coop with a nod. "You ever kept hens?" She shook her head. "Come on, I'll show you." They didn't say much as he guided her through the chores. The hens were nervous at first, sensing something wild beneath her stillness. But Nayeli had a way of moving that calmed them.
She didn't reach. She waited, let them come to her. Caleb watched as one hen, curious, pecked gently at her boot. She crouched, smiled faintly, and murmured something soft in a language the land had heard long before English ever reached it. He didn't ask what she said. By midday, she'd fed the animals and hauled water from the well without being told. When the wheel on the old cart wobbled loose, she knelt beside it without hesitation, her fingers tracing the bolts. She didn't have to ask for a wrench. She just pointed, and he handed it to her. There was no thanks, just the nod of one worker to another. By the third day, she started eating breakfast before he did, not out of comfort, but readiness. She was preparing for labor, for movement, for something that felt like control. And still, she didn't ask why he'd done it, why he'd paid for her. Maybe she thought it was pity, or guilt, or some darker thing that hadn't yet shown itself. He didn't ask what she thought. Some truths unfolded in silence. That night, as he brushed down the horse, he heard the sound of her voice from the side of the barn. Not loud, not speaking, singing. Low, slow, rhythmic. A song without harmony, but full of meaning. A lament, maybe, or a prayer. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he walked back to the porch, sat with his Bible in hand, but did not open it. He stared out at the edge of the property where the grass bent and the sky deepened to a bruised blue. A part of him wanted to warn her that this peace wouldn't last, that men like Myron Cole didn't forget debts or defiance. But he didn't, because she already knew. In her silence, in the way she scanned the tree line before drawing water, in the way she slept with her back to the wall and one hand always beneath the coat, she knew danger wasn't done with her. And still, she stayed. On the fourth morning, she spoke first. "You were a soldier?" He looked up from the saddle he'd been mending. "A long time ago." She nodded, as if that explained something. Then, "Your wife, she's gone?" It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, just looked down at the needle in his hand and pushed the thread through leather with a slow, steady pull. Nayeli sat down across from him and said nothing more. They worked in silence, but it was a new kind of silence, one not born of fear, but of respect. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the road there. The hills beyond the ranch turned gold with summer. Days grew longer, stretching like the shadows that clung to the fence posts at dusk. And in that lingering light, something between them began to settle, not peace exactly, but a rhythm, a language without words. Nayeli moved with purpose now, not out of fear, but familiarity. She no longer hesitated when Caleb handed her tools or pointed toward a task. She knew the weight of a pail, the stubbornness of an old fence post, the low mutter of the mule when it sensed a storm. But it was the plants that truly changed things. She found them first along the river bend, a cluster of bitterroot growing beneath the cottonwoods. When Caleb asked what she was doing crouched there, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she dug her hands into the dirt and gently pulled one from the soil, shaking it free. "Medicine," she said simply, "for fever." That afternoon, she walked the edges of the land, pointing to leaves, flowers, roots. Some names she offered in English, others in her native tongue. Caleb followed without interruption, listening. Every once in a while he'd nod and repeat the word, slow and careful, like testing the sound of rain on a tin roof. He wrote them down later, on scraps of paper, the back of old feed sacks. Not to use them, to remember them. And she noticed. The next morning, she placed a poultice wrapped in cloth on the windowsill where the sun hit it just right. Caleb didn't ask what it was for. She didn't explain. But when his knuckles cracked from the dry heat, he used it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, and for the first time, her gaze didn't drop when he looked at her. That evening, they sat beneath the porch overhang, watching the horizon burn orange. Nayeli pulled the feathers from beneath her coat, still worn every day, even as the heat built, and began braiding them anew with fresh sinew.
Her fingers moved in steady, sacred patterns. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "What does it mean?" he asked. She paused, then answered, "It's for remembering." He waited, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she asked, "Why do you still wear your wedding ring?" He looked down at his hand. The gold was dulled, the skin beneath pale from years of shadow. "Because remembering hurts less than forgetting," he said quietly. Neither spoke for a long while. Above them, the sky turned a deeper shade of night, stars slipping into their places like quiet witnesses. The wind shifted, and with it came a scent, sharp, faint, unmistakable. Smoke. Nayeli turned her head toward the east. Her eyes narrowed. "Campfire," she whispered, "not yours." Caleb stood slowly, following her gaze. No glow on the horizon, no sound, but her instincts were not to be ignored. He would check the ridge come morning. For now he reached for the rifle near the door and rested it across his lap. A precaution, not a threat. She said nothing, just reached down and finished the braid. In silence, they both understood. The rhythm they'd found was not safety. It was intermission. And beyond the edge of the land, something stirred. The wind came early the next morning, restless, hot, and full of grit. It scoured the prairie with a fury that set the fence wires humming and sent the chickens into a nervous cluster near the coop. Caleb watched the sky tighten into that peculiar stillness that only meant one of two things. A storm was brewing or something worse. He saddled the mule. "I'll check the east ridge," he said, not expecting a response. Nayeli stood barefoot on the porch, holding a bundle of dried herbs against her chest. She nodded once, then turned and vanished inside. She didn't ask where he was going. She already knew. The climb to the ridge was steep but familiar. Caleb had ridden it dozens of times, once with Eliza years ago, on cooler mornings when their biggest worry was whether the well would hold through August. Today the worry was simpler and heavier. He reached the crest just before noon. Below, tucked between two hills and masked by mesquite, a fresh trail cut through the earth, hoof prints, 5 or 6 horses at least. The ashes of a campfire still smoked faintly. No name carved into the dirt, no message. But Caleb didn't need one. He recognized the print. A deep scar in the center of the lead horse's track. The same as the judge's stallion. A black roan with a twisted gait and a temper to match. Cole. He'd come early. Caleb crouched near the coals and pressed 2 fingers to the ground. Still warm. Less than 12 hours old. He stood, jaw tightening. It wasn't the tracks that bothered him. It was the direction they'd taken. Southwest. Toward the ranch. Toward her. He turned the mule fast and rode hard down the ridge, dust rising behind him like smoke. By the time he reached the gate, Nayeli was already outside, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You saw them?" she asked. "Not them. Their fire." She nodded slowly. "They're watching. I know." They didn't speak of fear. They didn't need to. It was already there, threaded in the silence, clinging to the sunlight like ash. That night, Caleb oiled the rifle by lamplight. Nayeli swept the floor with methodical movements, pausing now and then to listen. Each creak of the house, each rustle outside the window made them pause. Not in panic, in preparation. "I'll speak to the Cole brothers when they come," Caleb said, voice low. She didn't answer. Instead, she lit a small bundle of dried sage and walked through each room, letting the smoke fill the corners. Caleb didn't stop her. He watched as she murmured words he didn't understand, letting her tradition shield the house in its own way. "Do you believe it works?" he asked. Nayeli turned, face unreadable. "Do you believe prayer works?" He didn't answer. She smiled, just slightly, and moved on. When she reached the doorway, she paused. "The judge, he wants more than me." Caleb looked up.
"He wants what I carry," she continued, fingers brushing the necklace beneath her collarbone. "And he'll keep coming, even if I leave." He met her eyes, steady, sharp. "Then we don't run." It wasn't a question. She nodded once, then stepped outside. Caleb sat in the quiet for a long while. The Bible on the mantel stayed shut. His thoughts churned like a river after storm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew what would break him. Not losing, failing to stand. Outside, the wind rose again, but this time it didn't carry dust. It carried warning. They worked side by side the next day, saying little. Caleb mended a harness that had started to fray, while Nayeli gathered roots from the edge of the garden. The sky was clear, but the heat pressed down with weight, thick, still, like the breath before thunder. By late afternoon, the sun dipped just enough to give them reprieve. Caleb sat beneath the cottonwood, sharpening his knife with long, even strokes. Nayeli joined him without a word, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, her skirt dusted with burrs and dry grass. She held the necklace in her hands, not hiding it anymore, not tucking it beneath the collar like a secret that could kill. Caleb glanced at it. The feathers had been retied with sinew, the beads polished with care. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. It felt old, older than the town, older than the language they spoke. She looked at him, and this time she didn't look away. "My name is Nayeli," she said, "daughter of Tova. He was chief before the land was taken, before the government carved it up and called it something else." Caleb nodded slowly. He didn't speak, just listened. "This," she said, lifting the necklace slightly, "is more than memory. It's a map, a guide to land my people still remember. Rich land, sacred. Some say it holds copper. Others say something deeper." She let the necklace fall back to her chest. "Cole doesn't want me. He wants this." Caleb didn't move. His knife lay still in his hand. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked. "Because kindness turns cold when it finds value," she replied. The words landed like gravel in a tin bucket, loud and bitter and true. He didn't try to deny it. Instead, he looked away, to the horizon where the prairie met the sky. For a long while, there was only the wind through dry grass and the hum of insects preparing for night. "I'm not here for your land," he said finally. "I know," she answered. And she did. Because in the days since he'd bought her freedom for a silver coin, he'd never once asked what she carried. He hadn't touched the necklace. He hadn't spoken over her silence. He had simply stood beside her, even when it hurt, even when it cost. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds," Psalm 147:3. The verse rose in Caleb's mind not like a hymn, but like a memory, soft, steady, familiar. His mother used to say it when patching torn sleeves or rubbing oil into cracked skin. But now he felt it in his bones. Not all wounds bled. Some walk. Some looked you in the eye and dared you to look back. "You think I should leave," Nayeli said quietly. "I think they'll come no matter what," he replied. A pause. Then, "But I'd rather stand for something true than kneel for something easy." She studied him for a moment, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of hide. Unwrapping it, she showed him a charcoal sketch, lines drawn in circles, symbols etched with care. The path to land her people still prayed for. She placed it in his lap. "You're part of this now," she said. He didn't ask what it meant, because deep down he already knew. Some things once seen could not be unseen, and some promises once made could not be broken. The knock came just after dawn, 3 hard raps, not the kind made by neighbors or friends.
Caleb opened the door slow, one hand resting at his side, near the rifle hidden just behind the frame. Judge Myron Cole stood on the porch, boots clean, gloves darker than sin. Behind him, two mounted men waited, rifles across their laps like bored executioners. "Morning," Cole said, tipping his hat as if he were greeting an old friend. Caleb didn't return the courtesy. "I hear you've got yourself a guest," Cole continued, glancing past the door. "Ute girl, goes by Nayeli. I believe she was part of a legal transaction not long ago." Caleb said nothing. Cole smiled, thin and dangerous. "Now, I'm not here to start trouble, just reclaim what's owed. That girl was purchased in good faith. Her guardianship, I mean. Contract's still binding, even if the price was theatrical." "She's not yours," Caleb said, voice even. "Well," Cole sighed, "we could debate that. But I've got paperwork. You've got land. And if you'd like to keep it, I suggest you make the right decision quickly." Caleb stared at him, eyes flat. "You've got 2 days. After that, you come back. You better bring more than paper." Cole's grin vanished. His hand twitched once near his belt, habit, not threat. "This land's worth more than your pride, Thatcher." "Then you shouldn't have let it go." Cole turned without another word. Dust rose as he mounted his horse and rode off, his men trailing behind like shadows that refused the sun. Inside, Nayeli stood just beyond the kitchen, arms crossed, shoulders tight. "He'll return," she said. "I know." They didn't speak of what that meant, not yet. Instead, Caleb walked to the barn, saddled his horse, and rode toward the northern ridge. It took most of the day to reach the cluster of farms, where families scraped by on barely enough water and too much dust. Folks he'd once helped during lean winters, fixing fences and sharing grain. He didn't ask for favors, he didn't beg, he just spoke plain. "Cole's coming for her. He's not coming fair. I'll stand if I have to, but I won't pretend it'll be easy." Some men lowered their eyes. One woman, Martha Bell, widow with 3 boys, offered him a jar of pickled onions and said, "I ain't got guns, but I got hands." He thanked her. By the time he returned, the sun had dipped behind the buttes, casting long shadows across the plains. Nayeli was on the porch, braiding something with twine. "You think they'll help?" she asked. "Some." "It'll be enough?" He paused. "It has to be." She nodded, then held out what she'd been weaving. A narrow band of woven grass and thread, decorated with symbols Caleb didn't recognize. "For courage," she said. He took it and tied it around his wrist without question. Then he sat beside her. No grand declarations, no promises he couldn't keep. Just silence and understanding. Inside the house, the fire crackled. Outside, the wind carried dust across the land, as if sweeping the earth clean for what was coming. They didn't need to say it. They were already preparing. Caleb rose before the light. The house was quiet. No wind through the shutters, no crackle from the fire. Just the stillness before a storm. He moved through the kitchen in silence, careful not to wake her. He loaded cartridges into his old Winchester, checked the axles on the wagon, hammered shut the side gate where the latch had splintered in last week's wind. No wasted movement, no hesitation. This wasn't fear, it was preparation. Because fear makes you flinch. Faith makes you ready. He paused once, hand brushing over a rusted horseshoe nailed above the barn door. His father's, a relic. Not lucky, just remembered. Inside, he packed rations and water into canvas sacks, moved through his tasks with the precision of a man who knew every square inch of his land and how much it might cost to keep it. By the time the sun began to crawl across the plains, he was on the porch, sipping black coffee gone cold. She stepped out quietly, wrapped in a shawl, hair still damp from washing. But her eyes, those eyes, were sharp,
watching him. "You were going to do it alone," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't answer right away, just sipped. "I wasn't trying to keep it from you," he said finally. "You just didn't want me to feel like I owed you." A pause. He nodded once. "That's right." She sat beside him. In her lap, she held something wrapped in soft hide. She pulled back the fold to reveal her bow. Not the crude one she'd been forced to craft in hiding, but the old one, her father's. The wood still smooth, the string freshly replaced with deer sinew. "I thought I lost it," she said, "but I buried it before they took me." Caleb looked at her, brow furrowed. "You don't owe me anything either," she said, stringing the bow in one clean motion. His smile was brief, grateful. "I know." They moved together after that, two people not rehearsing for battle, but preparing to stand. Caleb showed her the high points of the property, the old trail behind the well that ran along the tree line. Nayeli marked vantage points in the dirt with her finger, drawing from instincts older than any blueprint. They spoke in quiet tones, finishing each other's thoughts without needing to finish their sentences. When the day waned, they returned to the house. At sunset, Caleb knelt by the hearth, not for show, not for comfort, but because the weight in his chest needed somewhere to go. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you." Deuteronomy 31:6. He didn't say the words aloud, but he carried them, like a promise. Nayeli stood behind him, silent for a moment before kneeling too. She didn't know the verse, but she recognized the posture. Reverence, resolve. The firelight flickered across their faces. Neither looked at the other, but something passed between them nonetheless. Not love, not yet, but something stronger than debt, stronger than fear. A decision, to stay, to stand, and to face whatever rode toward them next, not as one protector and one protected, but as two people who had survived too much to kneel ever again. If you like this video, please comment number 1. If you don't like it, please comment number 2. The dust settled slow, heavy as judgment. Judge Myron Cole reined in his horse just beyond the split-rail fence, flanked by 2 armed men and a wagon too clean for travel. The look on his face was less about authority, more about possession, like a man come to claim what he thought was already his. Caleb stood still. No rifle in hand, no raised voice. Just boots planted in the packed earth of his own porch, spine straight, gaze level. The farmhouse behind him was quiet, but he knew she was watching. The judge spat into the dirt. "You're harboring property, Eddings," he said flatly. "What you bought was temporary custody. What I hold is law." "No," Caleb said, voice steady. "What you hold is debt. What I see is a human being." Cole scoffed. "She's not your kin, not your concern. You paid $1 to keep her warm, that's all." Caleb took one step off the porch. "She is not a debt," he said, louder now. "She is a soul." Silence followed. It wasn't the kind that waits for reply. It was the kind that settles deep into bone, when everyone present knows something just shifted, something irreversible. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Proverbs 31:8. The words weren't shouted, just spoken, like a bell rung once in a quiet town, enough to be heard by anyone with ears to listen. Cole shifted in his saddle. He hadn't expected scripture. He hadn't expected resistance. Caleb didn't move again. He didn't have to. The line was drawn, and he had stepped across it. From the shadows of the barn, a faint sound, a creak of floorboard, not loud, but present, like someone breathing in the silence, not hiding, but bearing witness. Cole's eyes narrowed.
"I suggest you think hard, Eddings," he said, voice low. "Men like me don't forget men like you." Caleb's reply was quiet. "Then remember this." He turned, walked back to the steps of his porch, not retreating, but reclaiming. Behind him, the sun began its slow descent over the hills, setting fire to the sky. Cole didn't move, neither did Caleb. They were two truths in conflict, and the land itself held its breath. Judge Cole didn't blink. His eyes swept the ridge beyond Caleb's property, then back again. With a nod, he gestured to the men behind him. They turned toward the wagon, pulling back a tarp to reveal more rifles. Too many for a simple arrest. This wasn't about the law. This was a message. A spectacle meant to break the will of one man and bind the silence of others. "You think you've made a stand," Cole said, voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "But all I see is a man about to lose his land, and maybe more." Caleb didn't flinch. Behind him, the screen door creaked faintly. A shadow shifted inside the house. He didn't turn. One of Cole's men rode to the side, positioning to flank. The other unslung his rifle, cradling it like habit. Cole smiled. "It's not just about her, is it?" he said. "You're not trying to save a girl. You're trying to make up for whatever hell you couldn't fix before." The words cut sharp, meant to sting. But Caleb remained still. It wasn't that he didn't feel them. It was that they no longer held power. "You're trespassing," Caleb said quietly. Cole leaned forward in his saddle. "I'm delivering justice." "No," Caleb said. "You're delivering fear dressed up in a badge." The man with the rifle took a half step closer. "Put it down," Caleb said, now to him. The man hesitated, then looked to Cole. The judge gave no signal, just stared at Caleb like a man weighing a beast before slaughter. The wind kicked up dust between them, a swirl of grit and silence. From the ridge, the cry of a hawk split the quiet. Cole's voice dropped low. "This is your last chance." Caleb's eyes didn't waver. "I've already made my choice." The weight of those words hung between them, final, immovable. The two men stared across the empty space. What once was a yard now felt like a battlefield. Then came the sound, low, rhythmic, hoofbeats. Not from Cole's men. From the distant edge of the valley, just beyond the cottonwoods, a second group was approaching. Slow, deliberate. Dust rising behind them like a quiet storm building. Cole turned, the first flicker of uncertainty passing his face. Caleb said nothing. He simply watched the line of riders grow clearer. Hats pulled low, faces weathered by sun and soil. These were not soldiers, they were farmers. The riders emerged from the tree line one by one, quiet as dusk, steady as truth. No flags, no rifles raised. Just wide-brimmed hats, leather gloves, and sunburnt faces hardened by years of labor and loss. These were not men trained for war. They were farmers, blacksmiths, wives in dust-covered dresses. People who'd known hunger, fire, and flood. People who owed Caleb Eddings nothing, but remembered everything. Cole shifted in his saddle. He counted 12, maybe 15. They didn't speak, didn't rush. They simply dismounted and stood behind Caleb's fence, arms folded or resting on tools, hammers, hoes, the kind of things that worked the land and, if needed, defended it. One of them, a gray-booted man with a bent back and a stubborn jaw, stepped forward. He didn't look at Cole. He looked at Caleb. "You need us?" the man asked, voice rough as gravel. Caleb nodded once. Not yet. The man nodded back and returned to the line. Cole tried to chuckle, but it caught in his throat. "What's this?" he asked. "A farmer's militia?" No one answered. The silence was louder than gunfire. Behind Caleb, Nayeli watched from the porch's shadow. Her fingers gripped the old wooden railing, knuckles white. She didn't understand all the names, but she knew what this meant. No one had ever stood for her people like this. Cole turned to one of his men. "Mount up, signal the rest." The man hesitated. Caleb spoke. "You'll bring more guns. We'll bring more people." He wasn't threatening, just stating fact. The land had made him a man of few words, and today it was enough. Cole's face flushed red. "This isn't your fight." "It became mine," Caleb replied, "the minute I saw the price on her freedom." A younger woman among the townsfolk stepped forward. She had once lost a child to fever. Caleb had stayed up 3 nights tending that boy. He hadn't saved him, but he hadn't left. Today, she would not leave either. Cole stared at the growing line. No weapons, no shouts. Just presence. And presence, he realized, was sometimes the greatest force of all. The sun dipped lower. The dust stilled. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Judge Cole didn't look so sure. The air was still, tense. Then the porch creaked. A soft sound, almost nothing, but it carried like thunder. Nayeli stepped out from the shadow. Her feet were bare. Her face was bare. No more hiding behind curtains or second-hand coats. Her long braid hung down her back, and at her chest the necklace of eagle feather and riverstone caught the last light of day. She walked slowly, not toward Cole, not away, but to Caleb's side. The judge's brows lifted. Well, look who found her voice. Nayeli didn't speak. She didn't need to. Every step she took was a statement. Every breath was resistance. When she reached Caleb, she looked up, not at him, but beyond him, at the men who had come to take her, at the law that saw her as a ledger entry, at the world that expected her to bow. She stood tall. The necklace, woven by her mother, worn by her grandmother, rested just above her heart. She touched it once, lightly. Not for show, for memory, and for strength. Caleb didn't look at her. He didn't have to, but he stepped half a foot to the side, not shielding her now, but standing with her. That, too, said more than words. Cole smirked, but it faltered. He saw something different now. Not a fugitive, not a possession, a person. And more than that, a presence that wouldn't shrink, no matter how many rifles were pointed. "You think this changes anything?" he said. Neither Caleb nor Nayeli answered. But someone else did. From the line of townsfolk, a soft voice. "It changes everything." It was the gray-bearded man again. He stepped forward, took off his hat. "All my years, I seen men try to scare others into silence, but I ain't seen many stand like she does." He looked at Cole, then at Nayeli. "You don't owe us a word, miss, but you got ours." Nayeli nodded slightly. Quiet gratitude, not submission. For the first time, she was not the girl rescued. She was the woman who endured. And the land, long used to being trampled and torn, seemed to pause, like it too was bearing witness. Cole's horse snorted, restless. Dust swirled around his boots. He was losing control, and he knew it. But the real loss wasn't power. It was certainty. And the woman standing before him had taken that with nothing but a step forward and the weight of her ancestors around her neck. Cole sat taller in the saddle, trying to summon the weight of his office. But the badge on his chest no longer gleamed. It dulled in the dying light, like a relic of something that had already passed. His men waited, restless, but they looked to him now not for command, but for reassurance. None came. Nayeli stood beside Caleb, still and silent. She wasn't armed. She didn't need to be. Neither did Caleb. He took one breath, slow and even. This land, he said, wasn't built on silence. It was built on hands, brown, black, scarred, and hearts that knew what it was to lose. He looked at Cole now, not with hatred, but with clarity. You want to claim her like a receipt, but the truth is, she's never belonged to men like you. Cole's eyes narrowed. And men like you think you're better? I don't think anything, Caleb said. I chose. He stepped forward, not with aggression, but with finality. You came to make a point. You brought rifles to do it. But what stands before you now isn't fear. Behind him, the line of townsfolk had grown. A few more had come, quietly, without call. Some carried buckets, others just their names and memories. A mother held her child close. A teenager tightened the strap of his overalls. They stood for nothing more than what was right, and that was everything. Cole's jaw clenched. He glanced again at Nayeli. She's just a girl. No, said Caleb. She's a daughter, a keeper of stories, a survivor. Then came a voice, not loud, but unmistakable. It was the same woman who'd lost her child. She's hope, the woman said, and we're done selling that. Cole's shoulders sagged. The false power began to crack. He reached for the reins, paused, then dropped them. No words, no farewell. He turned his horse and rode off, slow, as if every footfall was heavier than the last. His men followed, unsure whether to be ashamed or relieved. The wagon full of rifles rattled after them, unused. Caleb didn't move. Neither did Nayeli. They watched the law retreat, not in defeat, but in disgrace. No shots fired, no blood spilled. Just a quiet kind of justice, one born not of noise, but of presence. The last hoofbeat faded into the hills, swallowed by distance and dusk. For a moment, the valley held its breath. Then came a sound, barely audible, a sigh. Caleb's hand trembled just slightly as it dropped from the grip of his rifle. He hadn't needed to raise it, but the tension had lodged deep in his bones. His breath came out shaky, not from fear, from the release of something heavier, the weight of choice, the burden of standing alone, only to find he hadn't been alone at all. He turned, finally, toward the woman still at his side. Nayeli looked up at him, not with awe, not with tears, but with understanding. She reached out, not for his hand, not for his shoulder, but for his chest, where his heartbeat stuttered like a man who'd forgotten he was still alive. Her palm rested there, just for a moment. It wasn't thanks. It wasn't a promise. It was a recognition of pain, of strength, of a truth shared in silence. Caleb swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to name what had passed between them. But no words came, and none were needed. From behind, footsteps approached, slow, cautious. The old farmer who'd stepped forward earlier came up the path. "You all right, son?" he asked. Caleb nodded, once. "You did right today," the man said. "You reminded us all how." Others followed, quiet thanks, hands on shoulders, a few solemn nods. No celebration, just presence, the kind that lingered longer than applause. Nayeli stepped back as they gathered, letting the moment belong to the man who had stood when no one else had. But one child, a girl barely 12, broke from her mother's grasp and walked to Nayeli. She looked at the necklace. "It's pretty," she whispered. Nayeli smiled, kneeling to let the girl touch it. "It tells stories," she said softly, "ones we can't forget." The girl nodded, then ran back to her mother. And with that, the crowd began to disperse. One by one, the people returned to their wagons, their homes, their unfinished chores. They left behind no banners, just footprints, and the memory of a day something ancient had stirred. Caleb watched them go, then turned to Nayeli again. She didn't speak. Instead, she placed her hand on his again, light, steady. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. If you're still watching right now, drop a 9 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The days that followed passed with a hush, like the land itself was catching its breath. The fences remained upright, the chickens still pecked at the dirt, and the wind moved gently through the cottonwoods. But something had changed. Word traveled without shouting. A merchant passing through whispered of a standoff, of a man who said no to the powerful. A boy delivering mail mentioned a necklace and a woman who stood without flinching. And somewhere in the mountains, over late-night fires, old men and widows nodded quietly, as if some balance had been nudged back into place. It started with a knock, a soft, hesitant tapping on the front gate at dusk. Nayeli had just lit the lamp near the porch. She glanced toward the horizon, where the last strands of pink faded into blue. Then she walked to the gate and opened it without fear. A woman stood there, dusty shawl, 2 children clinging to her skirt. No words were exchanged. Nayeli opened the gate wider, stepped aside, and pointed toward the barn's back room. The woman nodded once. Her eyes were hollow but alert, the eyes of someone who'd run long and was still listening for hoofbeats. The children looked at Nayeli wide-eyed, not speaking. Later that evening, Caleb found the trio sitting near the hearth, eating cornbread and drinking warm milk. Nayeli didn't look up when he entered. "They won't stay long," she said, "but tonight they sleep safe." Caleb nodded. He didn't ask their names. He didn't need to. By the end of the week, 2 more arrived, one older man with a limp, and a girl no older than 16 with calloused hands and eyes like river stones. No one called it a refuge, no signs were posted, but the ranch had changed. The gate, once always shut, now creaked open often. The sound of hammers joined the birdsong as walls were mended and new bunks fashioned in the loft. The garden grew bigger. Caleb found himself building a second table from old wood he'd stored for years and never thought he'd need. One morning, he saw Nayeli teaching the children to braid grass into birds. She moved with quiet assurance now, not as a guest nor a victim, but as someone rooted. She still wore the necklace, always. Sometimes she'd touch it when the fire crackled, eyes narrowing, as if listening to stories only she could hear. Caleb didn't ask what the stories said, but he noticed that when new arrivals came, it was Nayeli who greeted them first. She offered them water. She listened more than she spoke. And when they hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether they were welcome, she'd whisper something in her mother tongue, gentle, melodic. They always stepped forward after that. The ranch had once been Caleb's alone. Now it breathed with many footsteps, many names, many burdens shared. At night, as he stood by the fence looking out at the land, he realized the silence he once clung to had changed. It was still quiet, but no longer hollow. It had depth now, like the hush that follows healing. The porch creaked beneath their boots as they settled into the old wooden chairs. Evening had fallen softly over the hills, like a blanket stitched from lavender and ash. The sun, slipping behind the distant ridges, left a smear of gold on the clouds, a final blessing on a day well lived. They sat in silence. No need for conversation, not now. Caleb's hands rested on his knees, fingers still rough from a lifetime of soil and timber. Nayeli's feet were bare, tucked beneath her skirt, a braid loose over her shoulder. Somewhere out back, the chickens cooed their last lullabies. From the barn came the rustle of hay and soft human breath, proof that life continued quietly. A breeze stirred, not sharp like before, gentle, full of scent, dust, earth, a whisper of pine. Nayeli was the first to speak. Her voice was low, even. "You didn't make it quick." She turned to him then, the necklace catching a final glint of light. "You made it good." Caleb didn't answer at once. He shifted, rubbed a thumb over the armrest where the wood had worn smooth beneath years of storms and patience. Then he looked at her. The crinkles at the corners of his eyes caught what little light remained. "The best things," he said slowly, "never are." A small laugh escaped her, not mocking, but warm, full of quiet agreement. The porch returned to silence. But it was a different kind now, not empty, not waiting, full, complete. He tilted his head back, watching the stars emerge, one, then another, then clusters, like promises stitched into the dark. "Let us not grow weary," he said softly, almost to himself. She looked at him, curious. Caleb continued, voice steadier now, "of doing good. For in due season we will reap, if we do not give up." Her eyes lingered on his, and this time it was her hand that found his, not out of fear, but as one plants roots. They stayed there long after the light was gone. The others inside would sleep soundly tonight. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, bread to bake, more strangers to welcome. But for now, nothing more was needed. Just this, the hush, the porch, two lives, once scattered, now seated side by side. Proof that sometimes redemption comes not in grand declarations, but in the quiet decision to remain, to rebuild, to believe. The lamp behind them flickered once, then held steady, and in the stillness the land listened. Somewhere in the rustle of wind, in the soft creak of porchwood beneath old boots, perhaps you heard something familiar, a voice from your own past, a time when right and wrong were measured not in laws, but in courage, when helping someone didn't need permission, just a willing heart. Caleb and Nayeli's story isn't just theirs. It belongs to every soul who ever stood between injustice and mercy, every neighbor who opened a gate instead of turning away. These are the true Wild West stories, where the grit lies not in gunfire, but in quiet choices that echo for generations. Maybe you've lived something like this, or maybe you've longed to. Either way, their story is a reminder. It's never too late to plant hope, never too far gone to offer shelter. If this tale touched something in you, share it, leave a comment, tell us what true courage looks like to you. And don't forget to subscribe for more true Wild West stories, not the ones with blazing pistols, but the ones that still beat steady in the hearts of good folks. Because in the end, the West was never just a place, it was a promise.